So can we begin with actually talking about your own experience? I mean, you had a very hard childhood. At what point did you realise how hard it was?
I think I realised it when I started to talk about it and see the reactions that other people would have to it. That's not to say that I didn't feel that it was difficult at times. It's just that you kind of adjust. So, I mean, like, if you look at the guys that get put in prison, you know, the first couple of nights might be quite nerve-wracking, but they become well adjusted to the anxiety pretty soon after. And I think it's the same for people experiencing different kinds of adversity, whether it's poverty or neglect or other forms of abuse. So for me, it was actually when I started to, well, actually, I never started to, I was kind of compelled to cathartically express what was going on as a way almost of figuring it out for myself. And then when I started to share the work that I was doing, whether it was music or writing or drama, which I was interested in early on, then I started to notice the reactions that I would get from people, which sort of indicated to me that this wasn't necessarily normal, and that actually what I had experienced was something that was pretty difficult. I began to learn that my story was useful up to a certain point, and then there was a sort of tension between what I wanted to talk about, which wasn't just the hard stuff, but also my ideas about how to solve it, or questions like how we're going to solve poverty if everyone here's job depends on it. And so then I started to recognise actually that some of the institutions that were set up to support me only wanted to hear a certain amount of what I had to say. And so I had to become a bit smarter about how to navigate my way into a conversation.
You introduce how violence can overshadow young lives very, very early on in the book, and what the impact of that might be as people grow up. What was your own experience?
I think the incident in the book that I describe is quite a specific incident where my mother lost her temper with me and pursued me through the house with a knife, held me up against a wall, and then she was she was kind of grabbed by my dad, and I was bundled out the house. That's a sort of acute, explosive act of violence that actually didn't occur too often to me, but what that does is that it creates a sort of vigilance in you, even at that young age, where there's an expectation that harm will occur. There's an expectation that you can't trust people, an expectation that you're living in a hostile world where even the people that are supposed to love you and look after you could just flip on you any minute. And that experience was couched in, obviously, my mother's alcoholism, which was couched in a broader community where the threat of violence is ubiquitous. I mean, your threat sensitivity, your risk perception are always on high alert when you grow up in a community like this. Even if you don't experience violence in the home, you're always navigating it. You're always assessing a vast array of potential threats. And for someone like me, then that means that you're living in a constant state of stress. And the minute that you become old enough that a new range of stress management solutions become available to you, then that's when you begin to initiate the cycle where you become the alcoholic and you become the person who's living in chaos and you become the person who's almost kind of aloof or ignorant to the trauma or harm that you're transmitting on to other people around you. So I use the story of my mother really as a way in to lend insufficient context to some of the behaviours that we often associate with the working class, the underclass, whatever term you want to use.
But actually, I wonder whether this book actually is really a book about parenting, because it's something that you come back to right at the end with your own child. And, you know, and parenting is a perpetual theme of poverty and how to improve the lives of young people in poverty. Now, how typical do you think your experience is?
I don't think it's the de facto experience of people who grow up in a socially deprived area, but I do think that it occurs more than the discussion around poverty has so far accounted for. If you go and talk to any young person, most people in a young offenders institution or people who have a cycle of criminality, or people who are homeless, or people who are suffering from addictions, alcoholism, you'll find a common theme emerging, and the theme is adversity in their early years. Now, this isn't to absolve them of responsibility for crimes that they've perpetrated on other people, whatever form they look like, or to absolve them from taking responsibility for their life if they can, or what aspects of their life they can take responsibility for, even as something as simple as phoning a sponsor, which is something I need to do to take responsibility for my sobriety. But if we really want to understand the nature of this sort of, I would say, underbelly of poverty, where cultures of neglect and abuse fertilise adversity and stress, then we have to get better at understanding and talking about it. And while obviously there were a great many families in my community where employment wasn't an issue, where adversity wasn't necessarily a serious issue. I mean, every family deals with adversity. At the same time, there's a disproportionate impact that these small pockets of adversity have on all of us, whether it's the taxes you're paying to build the prisons, or the services for mental health problems, or the A&Es, or the CPNs, or casualties for people who are attempting to take their own life. And that while it might not be the de facto experience for everyone who grows up in poverty, the impact is felt across society, across our institutions. It's felt in education, it's felt in housing, it's felt in addiction services, it's felt in criminal justice, it's felt in health. And we must get better at understanding that for a lot of people of that nature, stress, and I think generally as well, stress is a connective tissue between many of the kind of seemingly disparate problems in our society. When you look at someone who's homeless, you're also looking at someone who's often an addict or an alcoholic. You're also looking at someone who's dealt with adversity, someone who has either been in prison or is at high risk of being in prison, someone who's at high risk of being a victim of violence and also potentially a perpetrator of it.
Do you remember how insecure you felt as a 5-6-year-old?
For me, it was like becoming quite adept at reading other people's emotions. So in order to navigate someone who might become explosively threatening or violent, you become quite tuned into their voice tone, their body language, their gaze direction. I mean, this becomes a matter of intuition. And so that becomes a skill that serves you quite well. But then say you're sitting with someone that doesn't present a threat and you're in a conversation like we are now, and you're preoccupied with all of that other stuff, what's really going on here, blah, 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 becomes very hard to sort of focus in, becomes very hard to sort of emotionally attach or to attach in any way. And so these things that these skills that you develop to navigate hostility then become obstacles to attachment with other people, trust, even just being able to concentrate and be in the present moment. And then once you hit an education institution, and you start using kind of aggression or antisocial behaviour as a way to deflect from that vulnerability, then that's when the social exclusion can begin for a lot of people. What's important also to say is, while I totally understand and expected, though maybe not to the extent that it's happened, the incident with my mother, or my mother generally, to be a focal point, it's important for me also to say that I come from a very loving, nurturing, talented, caring family, as many people who go through adversity do, and that while those incidents that I describe in the book relating to my mother were very serious, maybe not serious, I didn't perceive them as serious as they were at the time, it's also important for me to sort of lay out that not every day of my life was living in fear of that.
I mean, when you say you came from a loving family, do you mean other people in your family, or do you mean your mother as well?
My mother was a different animal altogether when she, before the alcoholism sort of gripped her. And this is something that was always relayed to me by people who knew her. I mean, my mother had a strong maternal instinct. We were always very well dressed, well kept. She was also sort of very helpful when it came to other families, you know, helping out here and there where she could. She was a victim of various forms of violence that women are likely to become subject to. And I just don't think that she got the support that she might have got for whatever reason. And it's obviously really sad. But the story begins with her growing up in social deprivation, adversity, stress, and a certain range of solutions and management being modelled to her. And that's a story for a lot of people in this country.
Why do you think things hadn't changed to the extent in 1984, when you were born and afterwards, that this would stop in some way? I mean, I lived in Glasgow in 1988, and Glasgow was emerging as this sort of proud city of culture. It was getting rid of the estates. It was gentrifying all over the place. And, you know, the ideas of these sort of extreme poverty histories in Glasgow was something that was being sort of pushed aside and not talked about anymore, as if it didn't happen anymore. Yet your book lays out very clearly that it was, and that it was just as bad as it had been in the 70s and the 60s.
Yeah, the nature of the poverty began to change, I think. So what we were dealing with in the 80s was the first time, really, that there was a decline in industrial activity in the lifetimes of anyone, certainly alive at that point. And this presented a specific range of problems for those communities. So the first one was employment, you know, the mechanism by which you work yourself out of poverty. The second one was the fact that a lot of these towns, a lot of these places, they were physically built around industry. So when the industry goes into decline, they have no centre. We were dealing with a government at the time that showed a complete lack of understanding for the needs of people living in these communities, and just assumed that the market, as hyper-intuitive as it was going to take care of everyone. And it did. It produced heroin, it produced crack cocaine. These were the things that the market intuitively evolved to in order to provide stress relief for people. It produced bookmakers, it produced bingo halls. I'm not saying all of these things are bad, including the drugs, but for a certain type of person who is dealing with stress all the time, these innocent vices can become, you know, self-insistent compulsions that actually add to the difficulty in someone's life.
So how much do you feel that the people living in these areas and under these conditions have to solve their own problems?
For me, poverty exists in these two planes. Kind of like, see when you talk to like a physicist, and they'll say that certain laws govern the material world, you know, the law of gravity, cause and effect, rules and laws that we can sort of navigate our world with a certain level of predictability without even having to think about. But then you talk to maybe like a quantum physicist, and they'll see reality taking place at a different scale, where nothing in the sort of subatomic realm is subject to the same laws and operates differently. Now, what I'm trying to put forward is the idea that poverty is quite similar in terms of the two different scales that we need to think about it and discuss it. We have the systemic stuff. We have a precarious labour market, an economic and political system that's leaving too many people feeling that they exist on the outside of it, to the extent that they're going to that they'll risk democracy itself just to land a blow on a vaguely defined system that they feel is rigged against them. And then in this other scale, we have the urgency of being able, of trying to attempt to live, to have increased well-being in our lives, to be emotionally available for our family and our communities, to navigate our difficulties and stress. What I'm trying to do is take the platitude about personal responsibility that you hear from the right and actually, and kind of like re-own it as a person of the left and say, you know, you can call it self-efficacy, you can call it personal agency, you can gentrify the language. What we're really talking about is the extent to which someone can begin to start picking up the tools in their own life. And for each individual, that looks different. It might be me a few years back when a brown letter for the Department of Work and Pensions comes through my door and I'm only 2 weeks sober, and it's telling me that I owe them £3,500 of overpaid benefit. Doesn't tell me how I owe it, doesn't tell me the mistake, just tells me I better pay now. And straight away, I just go back into my old thinking. I'm just going to run straight to the pub. I'm just going to run straight to the off-sales bottle of Buckfast. I'll deal with this after. Personal responsibility for me in that moment is already knowing what lies down that path where I pick up that bottle and deciding to open the letter and just deal with it. And whatever way it is, for me, it was going to a welfare rights officer and the debt was immediately written off, funnily enough, the minute that someone who actually had an understanding of the system got involved. So I'm making the argument that if you're going to tell people to take personal responsibility, you need to understand intimately what you're telling them to take responsibility for, and then you have to at least not become an obstacle to that, as well as maybe potentially helping to facilitate people having more control over their lives.
But just as there is a huge amount in your book for people from the left and the centre to try and understand poverty and the underclass, as you call it, there are, it seems to me, some gifts in there as well for the right. You know, I mean, you talk about your own experience of alcohol and drugs, and it partly being a product of you getting so much money and benefits.
Yeah, because I felt if I'm going to... One of the benefits I had of writing this book was that my reasoning through the thing wasn't motivated by having to produce a certain political outcome or adhere to a certain political viewpoint. I'm of the left. I'm confident that people who know me will see that. So I don't feel like I need to sort of signal that constantly, which freed me completely and liberated me in order to just tell the truth as I understood it. The problem then is when that experience, just like someone committing benefit fraud, is cited as the de facto experience for everyone who has a drug problem or everyone who's on benefits, when actually I represent a minority of people.
So in your case, in your life, it's not that the system was not providing enough of a safety net for you, was it? It may have been providing the wrong things, and that may have been partly because you weren't being honest about what it was you needed. But it wasn't,
even you.
But
really.
It wasn't that, you know, it wasn't because of cuts. It wasn't because of the system being, you know, not putting enough money into poor people, was it?
No, at that time, I don't think it was. The environment that we exist in now is fundamentally different, and examples like mine are cited as justification for a lot of the cuts that we see. So, you know, I accept that I never rose to the challenge of accepting the support at the time. But the situation we are in now is fundamentally different. Still, there's the same misunderstanding, though. There's the same misunderstanding about how adversity shapes a person's interpretation of the world and themselves. And people who go through experiences like mine, a lot of people who go through things far worse, what they are navigating currently is a sensory obstacle course called society, where institutions like policing, like social work, just by doing their job well, create conditions of adversity. So whether it's police going through someone's door, a drug dealer's door at 8 a.m. and arresting a mum or a dad, they're creating conditions of trauma. Now that's a good job done, get the dealer, get them prosecuted, cool, job done. So what about if we start considering those areas where we might actually be exacerbating a problem and think, as many have, go in the door at 9:30 when the kids are at school? Now, I'm not saying that's going to address everything, but in every area of public life, whether you're talking about housing, or you're talking about employment, or you're talking about education, there's a similar dynamic where if we bring into our awareness the implications for someone who's experienced trauma, who's dealing with a hypervigilant sense of reality, who's unable to focus, unable to concentrate, then how do we create the conditions for them to read, to even become willing to learn, even become able to learn? And a lot of the time I see the social exclusion journey beginning in school, where a lot of children are excluded from school, signposted to institutions away from school, or they're kind of triaged until people know how to deal with them. And so really I would like to see us move into a more kind of trauma-informed approach across our institutions so that we can identify trauma early rather than having to mop it all up later on in a person's developmental trajectory.
How did you find music?
My dad's a musician. My dad's a songwriter. He plays guitar and other instruments. He also teaches people music. My family is very music in the sort of Celtic Scottish tradition. And so we were always around that stuff. For me, hip hop became my primary interest and at the sort of turn of the millennium, when my friend Sammy would bring round artists on CD and tape like, you know, Biggie Smalls or Nas or Tupac, Gangstar, Wu-Tang, and straight away this stuff had a sort of emotional resonance that just spoke to me straight away. I mean, the culture that I was presented with in Scotland just didn't speak to me. Even the poets. I mean, I know a wee bit more about Scottish poetry now, and I've kind of found the stuff that I like that talks about my experience. But a lot of the stuff you're getting in school, as beautifully written as it was, then it just... the barrier was so pronounced to actually getting through it that you just gave up, because not only is it couched in very high language that's difficult straight away, but also it's talking about, you know, that it's seeing everything from an aristocratic perspective almost. So you just can't find a way in. Hip hop became this thing where it was a low access level. I didn't have to own anything in order to participate in it. And also became a legitimate place for me to express anger. Whereas in a lot of these other art forms, you know, expressing anger, unless you're an actor, is something that really threatens people. Very early on, whether it was subconscious or not, this compulsion to be creative really started to emerge in me. You know, all the time I was working on things from a very young age.
Did you try hard at school?
I did some of the time. I struggled in school, not necessarily because I couldn't do the work, but the sort of school that I went to is a school where lots of young people are presenting with similar problems as myself. So it creates a bit of a patchy learning environment where you're not just thinking about the curriculum and academic success, but you're also navigating all of the social pressures that come with using words like beautiful to describe a girl's hairdo on a school bus full of like wee guys who, for whom unsanctioned language is either an invitation to mock you or to fight you sometimes. So you've got all that going on as well. I mean, you talk about Byers Road. The first time I went to Byers Road was for anger management. But the first observation that I made of Byers Road was how calm everyone seemed. The fact everyone seemed to dress individually, seemed to gesticulate with their hands, kind of like I'm doing now, because I feel quite comfortable. And
Byers Road, we should say, for those who don't know, is a road in the West End of Glasgow. It's a pretty studenty, middle-class, shishy area now.
Yeah, and so like that was the first time really that it came into focus, how different life could be within one city. Because I was only travelling one stop on the underground and suddenly I felt like I was in another country. And I think that was the formative observation that really just evolved over the years and maybe became a bit more, I don't know, sophisticated as new information came into play and new experiences. But it all goes back to that. It all goes back to saying, hang on, life is not just about you having more money. You have more emotional resources. You have more freedom to be who you are. And that's why you enjoy life more than someone like me who's on my way back to Govan.
You see, if we come back to sort of changing the world and trying to tackle poverty, if we accept we can't end it, you, towards the end of the book, you know, really lay down the challenge. You basically say you don't believe in politics or politics' ability to really solve poverty as a problem.
Yeah, it was hard to write that.
Well, if not politics, then what?
Well, there are lots of examples of, even just in Glasgow, of communities attempting to take more responsibility. And I grew up in a community that was very highly mobilised. I mean, we occupied community centres, physically stopped sheriff's officers entering people's homes to take their stuff for non-payment of an unfair tax, laid down and buried burnt-out cars in roadbeds to stop motorways being built through our land. So that's what I come from. So I know what's possible. Now, when I say politics can't solve it, what I'm talking about is a political class that's besieged by converging crises, sometimes of its own making. And I respect that the immediacy of those things means that discussions, deep dive discussions about poverty, its nature, the political social implications are difficult to have. Because ultimately what we have just now is a political class that are frightened of public opinion. And so it's about placating whatever anger feels the most electorally costly and visceral, and then worrying about how we deal with the problem later on. And you can just look at Brexit for an example of that. The current economic system, which sort of in many ways has created the illusion of choice to an extent. I mean, now all the shopping malls, it's the same constellation of Frankie and Benny's and Nando's. Anywhere you go, there's not much of a choice, really. Right? This idea of people as capital, as value. So it's making an abstraction of people's real lives. And ultimately, the big barrier a lot of community groups currently face is that they have to justify what they do in those terms that are set by people who don't grow up in those communities, who don't understand the minutiae of those communities. And if they don't meet the stipulations of aims and objectives of central government or its arm's length organisations, then they just get cut. And then that's another that's another instance where people who have actively participated have their worst fears confirmed, their worst fears that there's no point in trying, their worst fears that the system's not set up, local democracy is not set up with them in mind. And so I think that at every stage in our development as a society, when things have got difficult or things have got to a tipping point, then some of us have evolved to meet the challenge. Now, obviously, the collateral damage is not justified. The amount of people who will waver in these conditions of stress and adversity is horrific.
I mean, just to play devil's advocate, why do we need to spend a huge amount of effort on this? As long as people aren't starving and dying in the streets, and there's a basic safety net, and as long as average living standards are rising for the majority, why worry about the underclass?
I can understand why some people would come to that view. I mean, you're playing devil's advocate, but that is a view that's widely held, particularly among politically and culturally and economically enfranchised communities that are arguably quite distant.
A lot of people just kind of go, well, there's always going to be an underclass.
Yeah, of course. I think what we're talking about now, though, particularly in the age of social media, is that this is having a politically corrosive impact that's quite fundamental. And it's finding expression all across Europe, it's finding expression in the UK, and it's finding expression in the United States.
In populist politics, you mean?
What you're finding is that there's an eye for an eye attitude that's developing where people are, there's a sense that people want retribution now and might even be willing to vote against their own interests, arguably, in order to lash back at the system. Because there are just too many people in this society who quite rightly feel that no matter how hard they work, no matter how fairly they play by the rules, that they're ultimately treading economic quicksand, just keeping their head above it. And then we say, well, why don't they take a risk? Why don't they open a business? You know what the risk is when you're in quicksand, don't you? Making the tiniest move means you might become deeper submerged in it. And so the whole idea of social mobility is revealed as a sort of comforting myth, because really what we're dealing with in Britain right now is chronic social immobility. Well, no matter how hard you work, no matter what you do, then you will find yourself living in stress, worrying, while you're being farmed by big organisations for your data, for your money, for your cognitive bandwidth. And really those conditions create a tinderbox atmosphere, and then it just takes the wrong kind of political figure to emerge and say, I understand your anger, hey. And really what I'm trying to do by analysing different types of anger in the book is to say, look, I'm a working class person. I understand your anger. I also understand this other guy, it says he does, hasn't got a clue. And more people who come from my sort of background are hopefully going to be vomited up soon as an antidote to some of the populism that we're seeing. The rules to the game have changed, and the issues that used to be on the fringe are now centre ground issues. So we have to adapt in order to meet those challenges while still retaining our principles.
Do you think the underclass is susceptible to populist politicians and racism in particular?
I think anyone can be susceptible to those ideas, particularly when they're presented as solutions to other problems that people are experiencing. So obviously immigration's a real live issue now in many communities, even in communities that aren't actually affected by immigration at all. And I think where people become susceptible to some of the myths around it, like it's immigration that's causing a crisis in the NHS, for example, then it's often because they're living in conditions of stress. And actually stress is a physiological state that impairs so many of our basic functions, one of them being empathy, one of them being the capacity to correctly interpret what's going on, high risk threat sensitivity. So in those conditions, then people will find themselves being more aggravated, agitated, and sometimes resentful. And if someone begins to detect that and try to shape that anger and give it a political signature, then they sort of can spoon feed people myths about the causes. I mean, obviously Brexit, we understand that a lot of it was around immigration concern. What Brexit doesn't do is address the fundamental problems of our economy. In fact, what it does do is buy time for the people who've got us into this mess, the political class and some of the business class, to actually just get enough time to figure out how they can exploit after. Because their interests are served regardless. It doesn't address neoliberal economics, which have left a lot of people feeling disenfranchised and disillusioned. It doesn't address wealth polarisation. All it says is, we'll do something about the borders and everything's just going to work out. And while I understand where that feeling comes from, and I do recognise that immigration, particularly in areas of poverty and violence, can be a very challenging thing for not just people who live there, but for the immigrants themselves, then at the same time, I think that it's an illusory solution. It's just where I'm coming from. I want to be a bit smarter about how I engage that sort of mindset, because I don't know if it even makes political sense at this point. I mean, to dismiss all concern as illegitimate, although I completely understand. And obviously, as a white guy, as much as I'm aware of racism, as much as I feel strongly that it must be condemned, I could never feel its effects as acutely as people of colour, and I completely recognise that. So I recognise that maybe my view on that issue might be shaped by not being subject to that particular force. I mean,
it's interesting you say as a white guy. To what extent has the whole gender eruption and the eruption of gender politics reached the estates where you grew up?
Well, it's a funny intersection, actually. What you're talking about is the sort of the intersection between these new ideas that have emerged into the mainstream around intersectionality, identity, the extent to which different types of people, based on their identity, will interface with society and its institutions. Actually, in my community, and one of the reasons I initially found so-called identity politics so challenging, was not because I don't believe in equality for all, it was because I was struggling to reconcile the idea of women as, you know, I guess maybe an oppressed class or a second class to men with my own experience, which was very personal to me, which was that, you know, whether it was my mum, whether it was my granny or my aunties, women were in charge in my life. And so those initial clumsy attempts to articulate, you know, the classic sort of not all men crap that a lot of us do initially as we navigate this stuff intuitively.
Are you terrified to talk about it?
No, I'm not.
Did you get nervous when asked about it?
No, but I learned some difficult but very necessary lessons about the care you need to take when you do talk about it. I mean, I look at things usually from an artist point of view, as much as I don't always have that persona. So I'm always about what's the stuff that we're not allowed to discuss, what's the stuff that is out of bounds. I tend to move towards that a lot of artists I'm inspired by. Now, while I still think that's legitimate ground for an artist to cover, you have to be clever about how you do it, because actually the forces on the right that are creating such a challenge to the left on these matters, particularly online, they've adopted the kind of veil of provocateurs, of non-conformists, of rebels, something that we traditionally would see ourselves as on the left. So I learned some lessons about the fact that just because something feels challenging to me, that doesn't necessarily, that shouldn't redirect my thinking on politics. I shouldn't just jump on YouTube and fall down the first rabbit hole that makes me feel good. And secondly, as someone who's kind of made a living out of making middle class people feel uncomfortable, it would be a bit hypocritical of me to turn around to women or radical feminists when discussing issues of everything from gender pay gap to domestic violence and tell them that they can't make me feel uncomfortable or challenge my views. And my Fringe show really is an attempt to articulate how I navigated that personally as a man. I know it's not to make it all about men, but as a man with a platform and a community of young men and a landscape with lots of new ideas, I'm trying to articulate how you can find your way back to your politics and reconcile the personal with the political.
I mean, having said that you don't really believe the political system has the answers to these problems that you detail, what can politics do? What do you think the political system can achieve then?
The political system...
As opposed to individuals. I mean, you said a lot about what you think individuals can do and communities can do.
It's important to acknowledge that the UK model of democracy is dysfunctional. And if you go and talk to Welsh probation officers, or you go and talk to people in Scotland, or you go and talk to people in Ireland, you'll find the same themes emerging, which is London doesn't take incoming calls. And it's not just politics in London that doesn't take incoming calls. So what we need, whether it's a new settlement on how power is distributed around the UK, or whether it's the sort of hands-up moment of humility from the political class in London to say, actually, there's a lot of this that we're missing, there's a lot of this that we're getting wrong. It's counterintuitive for a politician to do that. That's why pressure needs to be applied. That's why we need movements. That's why we need activists, as irritating as they can be, and I include myself in this. All the advances that we have in terms of human rights, in terms of equality, in terms of public services, housing rights, every single thing all came usually from a left-wing group of people who wouldn't shut up no matter how much right-wing press demonised them and no matter how annoying people in their own community found it. And so in this social media age, we just need to get more tooled up and sophisticated, because this is one thing the right do really well. We need to get more sophisticated about how the average person navigates new ideas intuitively on social media, the implications of conducting our politics on that. And I believe we need to use social media to organise meeting up in real life, get together, get a sense of one another, talk about the difficult issues in forums, physical forums where we can see and sense each other. And then I think from that, we can start to begin understanding the needs of communities, what they want, what the problems are, and then beginning to articulate a clearer vision from the left about how we would go about addressing the problems in our society.
Have you found Corbyn a disappointment?
I think Corbyn's very effective in campaign mode, and I know that he's in campaign mode all the time. There's a lot of grassroots stuff that goes on with the Labour Party just now, and I think they're trying to reactivate a lot of those kind of closed cells. And they have very deep roots in a lot of the communities that sort of turned away during the New Labour years. My frustration is that Corbyn presents himself as a radical alternative, and this is why he won't necessarily engage in the usual way that you should with mainstream media if you want to get elected. So on one hand, it's radical, and then on the other hand, he's pro-Trident. And so how can you occupy both of those positions? If you're going to say Trident renewal is politically feasible or doable or whatever, then just play the game. You know, this is a government in more disarray. Just a poll released today, 10% approval rating of the government's handling of Brexit. This is the moment the government's on the ropes. This is the moment we need a strong opposition. This is the moment to sort of show your teeth a wee bit, not to use too much kind of violent language. But you know what I mean? And for me, you're either radical or you're pro-Trident. My natural political position would be to vote Labour. I did vote Labour, and a lot of people in Scotland did, and a lot of us got hell for it from the independence movement, completely understandably. But also I can sense a lot of people who did vote for Corbyn cooling to him again, because there's just there's a constant lack of clarity from my perspective and a lot of people's perspective around the sort of country that we want to actually build.
Right at the end of your book, you come back to the very personal, and you recognise that your life has changed and the lives of your people in your family have changed for the better, going to university, all that kind of thing. Do you think ultimately that's what this becomes about? That the working class, if you like, can only ever solve their problems by becoming middle class, and that there is no such thing as a stable, satisfactory state for people who don't earn a lot of money.
You accused me of being middle class. Of all the things people have said about me over the years, I think that's the one I take most offence to. I understand what you're saying there. I think what I was trying to infuse the final third of the book with was that regardless of your circumstances, usually they are temporary, whether that's conditions of mental or physical difficulty or economic hardship, and that while obviously we need to continue to pressure our politicians and also contribute in our communities, then I do think it's important that, as difficult as things are here, that we locate some sense of gratitude for the fact that we grew up in a country where we have enough liberty that we can protest things, where we have an education system at least that exists, that's free, that we could technically educate ourselves in order to overthrow the very economic system that we exist in. And I think that sort of liberty and freedom's not to be sneered at. And so really in the last part of the book, what I was saying was you can have a parallel journey through this. One is you know exactly, you feel strongly about what needs to change, you actively participate in that, but also take a little moment every now and then to try and find areas in your life that you're grateful for. To try and find areas in your life that you might turn a critical eye on your own behaviour. And I think it's the kind of balance of both perspectives.
I wasn't accusing you of being middle class, although I wonder why it is you wouldn't want to be. I mean, you know, my dad was an orphan and he starved as a kid, and he's the one who made good. He became a doctor and he made us middle class. I'm quite proud of that. Why would you not want to be middle class?
Well, I was kind of seeing the opportunity for a joke there just at the end. I think what class people attribute to me now is out of my hands. I think a lot of people, I'm becoming public property in a sense, and so's my work. I'll always feel working class at my core, and I'll always do my best to make sure that my connections with those communities and that experience remains very strong. But I accept completely that my claims to either being a victim or hardship are going to become thinner. It looks like, at least as the year continues and as my life continues. For me, really, the opportunity that's there for me now is to create a life for my children that is not as stressful as it was for me growing up. A place where they can feel open to express their emotions, because I think them being emotionally regulated is not the best contribution I can make to their lives, but the best contribution I can make to my community.
Darren McGarvey, thank you very much indeed.